Ever wondered how a bottle of whiskey could go from being a soldier's favorite drink to a bankrupt industry, then a status symbol worth $5,000, only to face another potential crash? That's the wild, roller coaster story of bourbon. It's a tale of war, marketing genius, generational shifts, and a massive billion-dollar gamble that might be about to go bust. Let's rewind. After World War II, American soldiers came home with a serious taste for bourbon. This wasn't just any drink, it was a symbol of home. The demand was so huge that bourbon quickly outsold its main rival, Scotch. But fast forward to the 70s, and the industry was in a free fall. A 60% market bloodbath left distilleries bankrupt, and bourbon was seen as a relic. Then something crazy happened. In the 2000s, it came roaring back. Suddenly, bottles like Pappy Van Winkle were reselling for $5,000, and people were camping out just to get a taste. But today, the industry is facing another crisis. With barrels of aging whiskey piling up and a new generation turning away from alcohol? How did we get here? The story of bourbon really begins in 18th century Kentucky. Settlers, many with European distilling know-how, found themselves with an abundance of corn. The U.S. government even offered land grants to anyone who would grow corn and settle the frontier. It was a perfect recipe. They started adapting their distilling techniques, using corn as the main ingredient. The name. It likely comes from Bourbon County, Kentucky, or maybe Bourbon Street in New Orleans, a major port for shipping. The magic ingredient, the thing that gives bourbon its signature amber color and caramel vanilla flavor, was discovered almost by accident. To transport the whiskey down the Mississippi River, it was stored in barrels. These barrels were often charred on the inside to clean them and remove residue from their previous contents, like fish or nails. During the long journey, the whiskey soaked into the charred oak, and by the time it reached New Orleans, it had transformed into something smooth, sweet, and deeply flavorful. By the 1800s, this Kentucky whiskey was a sensation, but the first great bourbon boom was ignited by World War II. During the war, production was diverted to making industrial alcohol for the war effort. This created a massive pent-up demand. When the soldiers returned, they were thirsty for the whiskey they remembered. Sales exploded in the 1950s. Brands that are now household names, Jim Beam, Four Roses, Wild Turkey, scaled up their operations. They improved production methods and launched national advertising campaigns, positioning bourbon as the all-American spirit. For a while, it dominated the market. This was bourbon's golden era. It became the stylish choice for classic cocktails like the Manhattan and the old-fashioned. It was the drink of choice in smoky bars and sophisticated lounges. Through a combination of efficient production and a strong cultural identity, bourbon managed to knock Scotch off its pedestal in the American market. It was on top of the world. But as we all know, what goes up must come down. The very generation that grew up watching their parents drink bourbon, the baby boomers, turned against it. Tastes so white, as granddad's drink, old-fashioned and heavy. A cultural shift was underway. The 1970s and 80s were all about lighter, clearer spirits. Gin and vodka took over, fueled by the rise of cocktails like the martini, famously promoted by brands like Bourbon was left in the dust. Distilleries that had been around for generations were forced to close their doors. The industry was in a tailspin, and it seemed like bourbon's time was over. For decades, bourbon languished. But then, in the early 2000s, the script flipped completely. A new generation, the millennials, started looking for something different. They were tired of mass-produced, flavorless drinks. They craved authenticity, craftsmanship, and a story. And bourbon had all of that in spades. The craft cocktail revival began, and suddenly, bartenders were rediscovering classic recipes. Small batch and single barrel bourbons became the new status symbols. Brands like Booker's and Blanton's, with their unique profiles and limited releases, became cult hits. Pop culture played a huge role too. Shows like Mad Men brought back the glamour of the 1960s, with Don Draper constantly sipping an old-fashioned. Suddenly, bourbon was cool again. It was complex, it was sophisticated, and it was American. Meanwhile, the cosmopolitans and apple martinis of the Sex and the City era started to feel dated. The number of distilleries in the U.S. skyrocketed, going from just around 500 in the year 2000s by 2023. This new boom created a frenzy. Distillers realized they could use scarcity to their advantage. The most famous example is Pappy Van Winkle. This ultra-rare bourbon became the ultimate unicorn bottle. A bottle that retailed for maybe $200 was being flipped on the gray market for $5,000 or more. People entered lotteries, stood in line for hours, and built relationships with liquor store owners just for a chance to buy one. This hype fueled massive investment. Buffalo Trace, the distillery behind Pappy, announced a $1.2 billion expansion. Campari dropped $161 million to upgrade the Wild Turkey distillery. The good times were rolling, and it seemed like the demand would never end. But the first cracks in the facade started to show in the mid-2010s. Maker's Mark, a hugely popular brand, announced they were lowering the proof of their whiskey from 90 to 84 to stretch their aging supply and meet demand. The backlash from loyal fans was immediate and fierce. The company was forced to reverse its decision, a clear sign that the bourbon community was passionate and paying close attention. The bigger problem, though, is the nature of the industry itself. Bourbon has to age, typically for anywhere from 3 to 10 years, or even longer. This means distillers have to make a bet on what demand will look like years in the future. During the height of the boom, with demand soaring, they gambled big. Companies like Buffalo Trace and Wild Turkey poured billions into expanding their capacity, betting that the hype would continue indefinitely. They bought up smaller craft distilleries, like the purchase of Wilderness Trail, and just kept filling more and more barrels, ignoring the warning signs that the peak might be near. And now, in 2024, the fallout from that gamble is starting to materialize. The situation is pretty grim. Kentucky currently has over 14 million barrels of bourbon aging in its warehouses. That's more than 2 barrels for every single person in the state. But who is going to drink it all? A recent Gallup poll showed alcohol consumption in the U.S. is at its lowest point in nearly 90 years. The generational shift is hitting hard. Gen Z, the new generation of consumers, has a very different attitude towards alcohol. A staggering 66% of them view booze as something poisonous or unhealthy. At the same time, inflation has squeezed people's wallets, and retail sales of spirits have started to drop. The price for bulk barrels of whiskey has crashed, falling from around $4,000 to just $1,000. The pain is being felt most acutely by the smaller players. Craft distillery sales have plunged. A company called Gerard County Distilling, which raised $250 million in just 14 months, has already filed for bankruptcy. The big players are trying to pivot, shifting their focus to ready-to-drink canned cocktails. But for the hundreds of small, independent distilleries that bet everything on the bourbon boom, the future looks bleak. So, what can we learn from this century-long saga of boom, bust, and boom again? 2 lessons stand out. First, for industries with a long time lag, like distilling, you have to be conservative. Overextension based on temporary hype is a recipe for disaster. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the brands and trends that shape our world. See you next time.